Welcome to the ride up to the site of the Smithsonian Institute's Astrophysical Observatory, APO, at the top of Harquahala Mountain. The road was constructed in 1983 by the Central Arizona Project, CAP, to access their radio transmission and gauging facility. The road rises almost 4,000 feet in 10.5 miles. The observatory was occupied from the fall of 1920 through the summer of 1925. Their route was a hiking and animal trail coming up from Arizona Route 60 and up the northwest side of the mountain. The rise for them in 1920 was 2,600 feet over 5.9 miles. All building materials and resupply were carried by burro, horse, and human. It was generally a 3-hour trek. Although the United States Weather Bureau had dubbed Harquahala Mountain one of the most cloudless regions in the world, right from the start, Abbott and Greeley fought an almost overwhelming battle with wind. Here's where we are going. The main people in my narration are Dr. Charles Abbott, Assistant Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution and Director of the institution's Astrophysical Observatory program, Alfred Moore and his wife Chella Moore, Fred Greeley, and William Ellison, who held the mining claim for the property on which the observatory was to be located. The basis of the narration and the quotes from letters are from the 2011 book Carry Through If Hell Freezes Over by Pete Bergeraff. purpose of the observatory was to compute the solar constant, which is the amount of energy reaching the Earth. The object is to find out how much heat the sun gives off every day. The sun's rays, in passing through the numerous layers of atmosphere, are deflected and lose considerable heat. This is expressed in units of kilowatts per square meter. These measurements were then compared with a similar observatory in Chile and then used in long-range weather forecasting. The miner, William Ellison, had his cabin about a mile and a half below the observatory. He supplied fresh vegetables and hauled materials up the mountain with his burros and later with the observatory's horse, George. The Smithsonian erected a 2-story building with a walk-in basement and 4 rooms on the second floor. It was built of adobe, but that began deteriorating in the winter weather. It was then repaired and covered with corrugated galvanized material. After a year, a shop building was erected immediately to the south. Greeley writes, quote, "We built the shop soon after Mr. Moore got back. It houses about 57 varieties of tools, a 2-horsepower engine, 3 small dynamos for the telephone, a lathe and workbench, paint, lumber, old newspapers, and baling wire, about everything including the dog, fleas and all. There is also a little centrifugal pump that supplies water for the shower that built on the back of the shop. The shower is quite economical as we have it so arranged to use the same water over and over. It is a fine addition, and we all like it." The closest water was at a spring at Ellison's mine, 1.5 miles away, but with eave troughs they collected rainwater, first in a 500-gallon tank and eventually a 1,500-gallon tank. Abbott, Moore, and Greeley rationed about 30 gallons of water a week for drinking, cooking, bathing, dishwashing, laundry, and processing photographic plates. That seems quite light, but that is what they recorded. They also recorded using only 3 gallons of water each for a shower by recirculating the water with a pump. Communication with the town of Wendon started with a heliograph system using mirrors. Errors resulted. Quote, "Instead of 1 gallon of alcohol, which we so direly need for the lanterns and stove, he sent 1 gallon of sheep dip." Unquote. A radio telephone was tried, but they were only able to receive stations from Denver and Los Angeles, nothing closer, and no transmissions. Finally, a wired telephone system was installed to connect the observatory, Mr. Ellison at the mine, the garage at the base of the mountain, and Bunker's store in Wendon. The store person would then walk messages to the railroad telegraph office. Almost immediately, they began scouting for a road route down from the mountain. One proposed route was to the northeast for about 6 miles. Greeley wrote, quote, "Never saw such a jumbled up mess in my life. It is one massive ledge on both sides with rocks and boulders from the size of a water bucket to a baby grand piano and on up to the size of a cottage." End quote. Another proposal was for a road to the south, which is the current BLM road. However, the big trouble in this direction is that the road would land so far away from any town on the railroad. Back in Washington, Abbott and their financier, Roebling, had already decided against constructing a road. Abbott replied to Moore, quote, "Mr. Roebling and I discussed it at some time ago, but he believes that if we should build a road, although it would relieve the isolation of the mountain to a considerable extent, it would do so at the expense of bringing up a horde of prospectors and fake mining concerns whose operations might make the observatory work there quite impossible." They did build a garage at the foot of the mountain and purchased a truck to speed up the trip to Wendon, the nearest town on Route 60. They started with a 1911 Ford and ended with a 1922 Dodge. Mr. Ellison began to have trouble with the Ford after 3 years. Finally, it got so bad that it didn't have power enough to get into Wendon empty. It was worked on and off for about 2 weeks, most of the time waiting for parts from Phoenix. The bill for the overhaul to the Ford was $50, and it worked fairly well for a trip or two. Then it started to go wrong again. Quote, "For the last 3 Saturdays I have gone to Wendon with Mr. Ellison because he can't make it alone. Always gets stuck in washes and gets back here way after dark, and about 2 weeks ago we didn't get back until the next morning. The cylinders have been rebored twice and oversized rings put on the pistons. It seems foolish of going to that expense again when the engine is a 1911 or 12 model. There is not much left on it that is Ford now. It won't start by cranking when it is cold, and if it weren't for the hill below the garage, we would lose all religion. It is necessary to scrape the soot and oil from the spark plug several times during one trip. It has very little power, even in low. Lately, it has developed knocks. Also whistles like a peanut. Last trip, the steering gear broke in 3 places up by the throttle. By driving it slow and low most of the way, we managed to get to Wendon. The thing needs new tires." Abbott writes to Moore, quote, "I went with Paul to the Dodge place in Los Angeles and got a 1922 Dodge delivery auto that functions beautifully. I hope that you will not wish to exchange it for a Ford, although you may be sure that I obtained it with fear and trembling, knowing your preference in that direction." Greeley later writes, quote, "Ellison says he won't drive the Dodge alone. He says he hasn't got the Ford foot worked out of his head yet." End quote. The Ford Model T transmission used foot pedals for gear selection. The Dodge used a 3-speed floor shift with a clutch. Greeley writes, quote, "Our shoe repairing outfit went smash proper the other day when I was putting some nails in my shoes. Because there is not a reliable cobbler in Wendon, I am taking the liberty of ordering another last and stand from Los Angeles. This is the worst place on shoes that I ever saw, being even worse than Chile. It is impossible to get sole leather that is of any account in Wendon. We find that soles made out of old tires last much better, but just now we are out of old tires." At the top is a solar-powered communication array with what appears to be a helicopter landing pad. The 360-degree view includes a look back at the southern approach. The remnants of the observatory complex can be seen, although the interior of the building is closed to the public. The Smithsonian's Harquahala Solar Constant program was moved in the summer of 1925 to Table Mountain in California. The program continued into the 1950s. Abbott was still working on his theories in his office on the top floor of the Smithsonian's tower in 1967 at age 95.
you.